She'd already decided nobody was coming. She was wrong. The fence line was down again. Third time since October. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't smile. He just said, she'd already decided nobody was coming. She was wrong. Clara Hayden pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and stared at the ledger open beneath them. The lantern threw her shadow long across the wall behind her, and the shadow didn't move because she didn't move. Not for a while. The flour-dusted leather cover of that ledger had gone soft at the edges from 2 years of handling. 2 years of her small, precise handwriting filling columns that never once told her what she wanted to hear. She wrote the date. November 14th, 1887. Then the temperature. 31 degrees at dawn, recorded from the thermometer nailed to the porch post. 40 at noon, dropping again now. Below that, the numbers she already knew by heart, but wrote down anyway because writing them made them real, and real was what she dealt in. 14 cattle remaining. Hay stores. And here she paused, the pen hovering, a wisp of dark auburn hair loose at her temple catching the lantern light. Hay stores at roughly 60% of projected winter need. Property tax due March 1st. $47. She underlined the number. Not because she'd forget it, because underlining it was the only thing she could do to it tonight. 320 acres of land outside Brierton, Montana, and every one of those acres had an opinion about whether Clara Hayden could hold them. The town had its opinion too. James had been dead 2 years. 2 years since the fever took him in 9 days, and in those 2 years Clara had kept every payment current, kept 14 head alive from an original 22, kept the house standing and the root cellar stocked. She had James's younger brother helping when he wasn't useless, which was about half the time. James's cousin, who was 20 and strong, but had the decision-making instincts of a barn cat. A hired hand who was 18 and willing and green as spring grass. And in the back room, James's elderly aunt, 68 years old, who needed firewood and meals and a warm place to die slowly in her own time. All of them Clara's responsibility. None of them enough. The town believed the ranch was failing. The town believed this because Henry Pratt told them so every chance he got. Now, Henry Pratt, 29 years old, sandy blonde hair parted on the left, wavy, just past his ears. A clean tan wool coat over a white shirt, a bolo tie with a silver clasp, and polished chestnut boots with pointed toes. The kind of man who stood with his chest slightly forward and his hands clasped behind his back. A folded property deed tucked in his inside coat pocket with the corner always visible. Always visible. Because Henry Pratt wanted you to know he had land, and wanted you to know you didn't. He'd been circling Clara's ranch like a slow hawk for 18 months, and the things that came out of his mouth at the general store had a way of landing in every kitchen in Brierton by sundown. That place will be for sale by spring. She just doesn't know it yet. He said that the way a man discusses weather, like it was simply a fact he'd observed, nothing personal. Like Clara Hayden was a condition and not a person. She closed the ledger. She did not think about Henry Pratt. What she thought about was the south fence line. It had been failing since autumn, and the reason was the soil. Half-clay ground along the south boundary, the kind that swelled when the rains came, expanded around the post base like a fist closing, then contracted when it dried, and left a gap the width of 2 fingers between post and earth. Every 3 weeks she reset them. Every 3 weeks. She'd dig with a narrow spade, fighting through the top layer of loam into the gray clay beneath, hitting rocky hardpan at about 18 inches and stopping there because 18 inches was where the spade met stone and her shoulders met their limit. She'd set the post, tamp the clay back around it, pack it tight, and within a week that post would lean 2 degrees east. 2 degrees, barely visible to the eye, enough for a heifer to press through when the wire slackened. She was out at the south line the next morning, resetting post number 7 for the 3rd time since September, when she heard hooves on the road. The man who dismounted was tall, 6'1" or close to it, broad through the chest and unhurried in every movement. Dark brown hair streaked heavy with silver gray, combed back but already loosening. A dark charcoal wool vest over a faded off-white cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. Worn black leather boots, dusty but oiled. He stood at the fence line and watched her work for a full minute before he spoke. And when he spoke, his pale blue eyes were on the post, not on her. "That post wants to be about 4 inches deeper." Clara's hands went still on the spade. She looked at him. She did not respond. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped to the post hole, knelt, and ran 2 fingers along the inside wall where the clay started. "You're stopping at the heave line. Below that, about 22 inches down, the clay gives way to a gravel bed. You pack below the heave line, the freeze-thaw cycle can't touch it." He took the spade from where she'd leaned it, and he dug. 4 inches deeper. The spade hit gravel and the sound changed. A dry, grinding scrape instead of the thick resistance of clay. He dropped a handful of gravel into the bottom, tamped it with his boot heel. Added a layer of clay, tamped again. Gravel, clay, gravel. Each layer packed so tight the post didn't shift when he set it, and pressed his full weight against the top. The post sat plumb, dead vertical. He touched his hat once, mounted his horse, rode toward town without asking for water, supper, or a name. Clara stood at the fence and pressed her palm flat against that post. It did not move. Back in the kitchen, she opened the ledger. South fence, post 7, reset by stranger. Method, layered pack below clay line. Holds. She closed the ledger. 2 cups of coffee sat on the stove. She'd poured the second one out of habit. The habit of a woman who'd made 2 cups every morning for 10 years and hadn't fully stopped. She stared at the second cup for a moment. Then she poured it back into the pot. Through the kitchen window, she watched him ride back down the road in the dusk, the fence line straight for the first time in a year, and she realized she forgot to ask his name. Thomas Calloway took a room above the dry goods store in Briarton for $6 a month and asked nobody for anything. He paid the first week in advance from a fold of bills so thin you could see the leather of his wallet through them. The room had a cot, a basin, a window that stuck in the frame, and a nail on the back of the door for his coat. That was enough. He did not complain about the draft. He did not ask for a second blanket. He hung his brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain from the nail each night before he slept, and retrieved it each morning before he dressed. And that was the closest thing Thomas Calloway had to a ritual. Work came in pieces. He split wood for the boarding house at 4 cents a quarter cord. He mended harness leather for Ed Granger at the livery, stitching with a curved awl and waxed linen thread, testing each seam by pulling it against his thigh until the leather creaked but held. He shod 2 horses the first week and 3 the second, and the farrier noted that he dressed hooves clean and level, rasping the sole flat before fitting the shoe, not just hammering iron over whatever was there. The town noted him the way a town notes anything unfamiliar, with sidelong attention and no commitment. He was not adopted. He was observed. He ate supper alone at the back table of the boarding house every evening, same seat, same plate of whatever was going. He did not linger. He did not make conversation with the other boarders or the women who served. Ruth Ames sat at the next table. She was 71 years old, 5 feet and 1 inch of silver white hair pinned without a single loose strand, a carved walnut walking stick dark with age in her right hand, and a pair of sharp brown eyes that had outlived every opinion ever held about her. She wore her dark navy dress buttoned to the collar, her cream wool shawl across narrow shoulders, and a thin gold band on her left ring finger that she had never removed since 1832. She ate her supper at the same hour every night, and she watched Thomas Calloway eat his, and she said nothing for 3 weeks. Not a word, not a nod. She just watched him the way a woman watches weather, reading it, not reacting to it. Now. Every Tuesday for 2 years, Clara Hayden had baked a pie. The method never changed because the method was the point. She started at 4 in the morning with cold butter, not cool, not room temperature, cold, cut with 2 knives in a chipped ceramic bowl until the pieces looked like rough gravel, not pebbles, not sand, gravel. She added ice water 1 tablespoon at a time, working the dough with her fingertips, never her palms, because palms run warm and warm hands kill pastry. The dough got pressed together on the first pass, not rolled, pressed flat with the heel of her hand just once, then folded, then wrapped in cloth and set on the windowsill where the October air could hold it. Wine sap apples, sliced a 1/4 inch thin, not an eighth, not freehand. A 1/4 inch, measured against her thumb knuckle every 3rd slice to make sure her hand hadn't drifted. Sugar, a little flour to bind the juice, a scrape of nutmeg so faint you'd think you imagined it. The lattice was woven, not laid. Each strip lifted and crossed over the next, tucked under at the rim, pinched tight. Cream brushed on top with a scrap of cloth. Raw sugar dusted from between her fingers. The oven had a dead spot at the rear left corner, and she had learned 2 years ago to rotate the pie a 1/4 turn every 12 minutes, or the back crust would char while the front stayed pale. The finished pie went to the general store. 75 cents. She had sold one every Tuesday for 2 years without missing a week. That 75 cents was the difference between making her quarterly tax and not. She recorded every sale in her flour-dusted leather-bound ledger with its cracked spine. The math was not complicated. It was relentless. Thomas began appearing on Tuesdays, not at the store, on the road between Clara's property and town. He was always doing something nearby when she passed with the pie wrapped in cloth on the seat of her wagon, fixing a neighbor's gate, rehanging it on new pins he'd forged himself, carrying lumber from the mill road, stacking fence rails that had fallen after the last rain. He would pause as she drove past. He'd tip his hat, that unhurried, deliberate motion, like a man who measures the weight of a thing before he picks it up. She would nod, gray-green eyes forward, dark auburn braid over one shoulder, both hands on the reins. No words. Not for 4 Tuesdays. Meanwhile, the south fence began to fail again. Not the posts Thomas had set. Those held plumb and solid, tamped in layered clay and gravel, each one sunk 30 inches deep. The posts Clara had set herself, using the old method. 1 pour of loose dirt, tamped once. Those shifted. 2 degrees. 3. Enough that the wire went slack in the second strand. She noticed before anyone else could. She went back to the south line and redug every post she had set. 14 posts. She dug each hole to 30 inches, packed clay in layers. 4 inches of clay, tamped with the heel of her boot. 4 more inches, tamped again, gravel on top, tamped a final time. It took her 3 days. She recorded each post in the ledger, post number, depth, date, condition of the soil. She did not ask for help. The 8th Tuesday, Ruth Ames was buying thread at the general store when Clara came in with the pie. Ruth looked at Clara, looked at the pie, looked back at Clara with those sharp, hooded brown eyes, the beauty mark on her right cheekbone catching the light from the window. She hasn't made 2 cups since James. Clara went still. Her hand stayed on the counter. Ruth paid for her thread, tucked it into her shawl pocket, picked up her walnut walking stick, and walked out without looking back. Clara stood at that counter for a long time. The storekeeper asked if she needed anything else. She did not answer. On the 11th Tuesday, Clara set 2 cups of coffee on the stove and did not pour the second one back. The first time Thomas Calloway set foot on Hayden land with permission, it was because the barn roof was leaking and Clara could not fix it alone. Now that sentence cost something to say, and it cost her more to make it true. Because Clara Hayden had patched that east pitch twice already on her own. Twice. The first time with tar paper laid flat and tacked with roofing nails, which held for 9 days until a westerly gust caught the edge and peeled it back like the page of a book. The second time she overlapped the sheets by 4 inches, weighted them with river stones, and sealed the seams with pine tar she'd rendered herself from stumps behind the creek. That held for a week and a half. Then the wind came again, and the tar paper lifted, and the rain found the same 2 warped boards it had always known, and the water ran down the inside of the east wall and pooled in the hay she could not afford to lose. The problem was height. The leak sat along the ridge beam where the east pitch met the capboard, a full 14 feet above the barn floor. Clara could reach the lower courses from a ladder. She could not reach the ridge. She had tried. She had stood on the second-to-last rung with her boots wedged sideways and her arms stretched full, and she was still 8 inches short of where the boards had cupped. So she rode to town. She tied her horse outside the dry goods store and went in and asked Emmett Ward, who ran the counter and knew every man's business within 30 miles, if anyone was available for hire to fix a barn roof. Emmett looked at her over his spectacles. He mentioned one name: Thomas Calloway. Clara's hand paused on the counter. She looked at the wall behind Emmett where the spools of wire hung on wooden pegs. She said she'd think about it. Then she bought a pound of salt and 4 yards of cheesecloth and rode home. She thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she rode back and told Emmett yes. Thomas arrived the next morning before 7. He came on foot, which meant he'd walked the 1.25 miles from wherever he'd been staying, and he carried a canvas roll of tools across one shoulder. The brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain caught the early light when he climbed the ladder to look. What he found was worse than Clara had described. The 2 boards along the east pitch hadn't just warped, they'd cupped. Moisture had entered through the grain ends where they butted against the ridge cap, wicking inward through the fibers, swelling the face side while the backside dried and contracted. The original builder had set them grain side up, which meant every rain drove water deeper into the wood instead of shedding it off. The nails, common iron, not galvanized, had rusted and expanded inside their holes, splitting the wood further, creating channels for more water. A small mistake compounding into structural failure over years. He pulled the old boards one at a time. Each nail came out orange and brittle. He lowered the warped lumber to Clara, who stacked it against the east wall without being asked. Then he took his draw knife from the canvas roll and planed the edges of the fresh boards he'd brought. White pine, quarter sawn, tight grain. He worked the draw knife toward himself in long, even strokes, shaving curls of pale wood that fell and caught in the breeze. Each board got planed until the edge was straight enough that when he held 2 together, no light showed between them. Clara handed materials up from below. Tools went up in a bucket on a rope. They worked for 6 hours. The sum total of their conversation was this: "Hold that end. Hand me the draw knife. Step left." That was all. 6 hours, maybe 40 words between them. The first board he seated split along the grain the moment the nail went in. He'd driven it too close to the edge, 3/4 of an inch instead of 1.5 inches, and the dry-aged pine couldn't take the lateral pressure. The crack ran 6 inches before it stopped. Thomas looked at it. He did not curse. He did not explain. He pulled the nail with the claw end of his hammer, set the split board aside, and picked up a fresh one. This time he took an awl from his tool roll, a short steel spike with a wooden handle worn smooth from years of use, and he pre-drilled every nail hole before driving the galvanized nail home. Each hole was punched clean through, just slightly smaller than the nail shaft, so the wood gripped without splitting. Clara watched this from below. She said nothing. That evening, after Thomas had gone, she sat at her kitchen table with the flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger open and wrote in her careful hand, "Pre-drill nail holes on dry-aged boards to prevent splitting." Now, while Thomas was up on that roof, right around the 4th hour, a rider came along the north road. Sandy blonde hair past his ears, clean tan wool coat, polished chestnut boots with pointed toes. Henry Pratt, 29 years old, 480 acres to the north, good grass, year-round water, not a single payment owing. He'd made it known around town, not loudly, not rudely, but with the steady confidence of a man who'd never been the second best option in any room, that he would buy the Hayden property at a fair price whenever Clara came to her senses. He tipped his hat as he rode past. His eyes went to Clara standing by the barn. Then up to the roof, where Thomas Calloway knelt with a hammer in one hand and a galvanized nail between his teeth. Henry looked at that for about 3 seconds. Then he rode on without stopping. That Sunday at the community gathering, Clara sat in her usual place at the end of the last table. Thomas sat 4 seats away, at the same table. Nobody sat between them, and nobody said a word about it, which in a town like this meant everybody was saying everything. The barn roof was finished at dusk. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee. They stood on the porch, not sitting, each holding a cup. Thomas asked about the hay stores. Clara opened the ledger from memory and told him the number. 1,400 pounds, give or take 40. He nodded once. He set his cup on the porch railing, still half full. He said, "Good night, Mrs. Hayden." And she said, "Clara." and that was the first time she had offered her name to anyone in 2 years. Before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I mean that. Whether it's 2 in the morning in the Philippines or you're driving through Oklahoma right now with the windows down, tell me. I want to know who's out there. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened the week before the storm. Clara. She'd given him her name. First time in 2 years she'd offered it to anyone, and she'd offered it standing on a porch in the dark to a man she'd corrected on a fence post angle 6 weeks earlier. That name hung in the valley air after Thomas Calloway walked back to his horse and rode the 3 miles home. And it was still hanging there the next morning when the sun came up over the eastern ridge and lit the frost on every blade of grass across the Hayden property. What followed was not a conversation. It was not a courtship, not by any word either of them would have used. What followed was a series of appearances, objects materializing in places where only one person could have put them. 3 cedar fence posts appeared by the south gate sometime before dawn on a Tuesday. Clara found them at first light, leaning against the gatepost, bark still damp, smelling of fresh-cut wood and lantern oil. The cuts were clean. Someone had worked them with a draw knife, probably by the light of a single flame, probably at 2 or 3 in the morning. She ran her hand along the nearest one, still cool from the night air. She did not look toward the road. She carried the first post to the fence line and began measuring. A biscuit wrapped in cloth showed up on the porch railing on Thursday. Her own recipe, the buttermilk biscuit she'd baked for him the Tuesday before, the one she'd set on the table without comment when he'd come to check the barn loft for rot. He'd eaten 3. This was the cloth they'd been wrapped in, washed, folded into a square, returned to the railing with nothing inside but crumbs and the message those crumbs carried. He had eaten every one. That was all the cloth needed to say. Dry leather gloves appeared on the fence post nearest the barn on Saturday. Not new gloves, worn soft at the palms, oiled recently, sized for a woman's hands. Placed on the exact post where Clara always rested her hands first thing in the morning, the post where her knuckles went white and stiff in the cold before she'd even started work. Someone had watched her long enough to know which post. Someone had paid that kind of attention. Neither of them said a word about any of it. The ledger changed. That flour-dusted, leather-bound book with the cracked spine, the one Clara kept on the kitchen table and carried under one arm when she walked the property. It started carrying 2 voices. Thomas's handwriting appeared beneath hers one evening. Larger than Clara's script, blockier. Letters that pressed hard into the page like a man who measured the weight of a thing before he picked it up. He'd written, "Fence post set, south line, 4. Hay bales moved to raised crib, 12. Firewood split and stacked, east wall, 2 cords." Clara found the entries. She read them twice. Her gray-green eyes moved across each line slowly, and then she picked up her own pencil and continued writing beneath his in her small, precise hand. Firewood inventory, total, 6. 4 cords. Barn sealed, north loft. Hay, raised crib, 38 bales. 2 people writing in the same book, neither acknowledging it. That ledger held more honesty than most marriages. Then Henry Pratt rode up. Sandy blonde hair freshly combed, bolo tie with that silver clasp catching the light, polished chestnut boots that had never once touched mud they didn't choose. He dismounted like a man arriving at a property he already owned in his head, removed his hat, stood there with that folded deed corner peeking from his coat pocket like a calling card from the future he'd already planned for her. He told Clara he'd spoken to the bank, said he could purchase her mortgage at a fair rate and fold the Hayden land into the Pratt operation. 320 acres absorbed clean. She'd be free of debt. He said it the way a man offers a life raft to someone he's already decided is drowning. Clara stood on the porch, straight-backed, chin level. That dark auburn braid over one shoulder, the small birthmark below her left ear catching the late afternoon light. Her hands gripped the porch rail, not in fear, in patience. "I'm managing." 2 words. That was all she gave him. Henry looked past her. He saw the new cedar posts along the south fence. He saw the repaired barn roof. He saw 6 cords of firewood stacked tight against the east wall. His hazel brown eyes moved across all of it, calculating, recalculating. He put his hat back on. "Winter's coming, Mrs. Hayden. I know what's coming." He rode away. The folded deed stayed in his pocket. For now. That evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open. Thomas was on the porch splitting wood. His feet set shoulder-width apart on the frozen ground, the axe head resting on the chopping block between swings, while he read the grain of each round of dry pine. He'd rotate the piece, find the hairline check running from the center, set the log so the crack faced him, and bring the axe down along that natural split line. Frozen wood sounds different, sharper, almost metallic, a clean crack that carries across a valley like a rifle shot. Green wood gives a dull, wet thud. Thomas's axe was hitting frozen pine, and every stroke rang out clean. Clara spoke through the open window. She did not look at him. "No man would want a woman with 4 people depending on her and $47 she doesn't have." Thomas set the axe head on the chopping block. He looked at the window, those pale blue eyes steady beneath heavy dark brows. "I'm not most men." Clara did not respond. Thomas picked up the axe and split the next log. The sound carried across the dark valley. 2 days later, the sky changed. The light went flat and bronze, the kind of light that drains color from everything it touches. Cattle bunched against the south fence, pressing their bodies together, facing away from the north. Clara opened the ledger. Temperature at 6 a.m., 34 degrees. Temperature at noon, 28 degrees. Temperature at 6 p.m., 15 degrees. She wrote beneath the numbers in her small, precise hand. Storm coming. Hay on raised crib. Firewood under cover. Barn sealed. The temperature dropped 19 degrees in 4 hours, and by midnight the first real snow of the season was falling sideways. The storm hit the Briarton Valley on the night of November 14, 1887, and it did not leave for 6 days. By 2 in the morning, wind had peeled the tar paper clean off the east side of the barn. Just ripped it away like skin off a knuckle, sent it sailing into the dark where nobody would find it until spring. But the boards underneath, the ones Thomas Calloway had reseated in October with galvanized nails driven flush, spaced 4 inches apart, each one sunk with 2 precise strikes. Those boards held. They flexed. They groaned in the gusts. They did not come loose. Clara Hayden stood at the barn door at dawn and held her hand flat against the interior wall. 22 degrees inside. Cold enough to see her breath hanging in the lantern light. Not cold enough to kill. The cattle pressed together along the south wall, steam rising off their backs. All 14 accounted for. She counted them twice because that is what you do when counting matters. Back in the kitchen, she opened the flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger with its cracked spine and recorded. November 15. 14 logs burned overnight. She did the math by the light of a single candle. At 14 logs per night, she had enough split wood stacked under the lean-to for 9 days. The storm, by every sign she knew how to read, the pressure, the color of the sky before it disappeared, the way the horses had paced 2 days prior, would last 5 to 7. She wrote the numbers. She closed the ledger. She put the kettle on. The south fence held. Every post along that quarter-mile line stood plumb, packed tight in its layered bed of gravel and clay, tamped in stages the way Thomas had shown her and the way she had corrected on the second day. Not one post shifted. Not one wire sagged. You could have sighted down that fence line with a rifle barrel and found nothing to complain about. The north fence was a different story. 3 posts along a 60-yard stretch. The section Clara hadn't gotten to yet. The old posts, still set shallow in straight clay with no gravel base, shifted in the frozen ground overnight. Leaned 2, maybe 3 degrees east. Enough to slacken the wire. Enough that a panicked steer could push through. On the second night, Thomas went out. He carried a lantern in one hand and a kettle of boiling water in the other. The wind hit him sideways the moment he stepped off the porch. Clara's work gloves, the heavy leather pair lined with wool, were on his hands because his own gloves were the ones he had left folded on her fence post 3 weeks ago, and she was wearing those now. He had not asked for them back. She had not offered. He poured the boiling water around the base of the first post, melting the top 2 inches of frozen clay into something he could work. Then he dug with his bare hands. No gloves now, fingers in the mud, scooping out the wet clay and replacing it with gravel he'd hauled from the creek bed in a bucket. He packed it in layers, a handful of gravel, then clay pressed flat with his palm, then gravel again, the way you build a foundation that will not move. He did this for 3 posts in wind that was trying to knock him off his knees. The lantern blew out twice. He relit it twice. His hands were raw and red when he finished, and he said nothing about them when he came back inside. Now, the hay. Clara's hay sat on a raised crib, 18 inches off the ground on cedar rails. Every bale dry, every bale usable. Over on Henry Pratt's operation, that well-groomed son of a bitch with his polished chestnut boots and his folded property deed, hay was stored flat against the ground. When the snow melted and refroze and melted again over 6 days, moisture wicked up through the bottom bales like tea through a sugar cube. 30% loss, conservatively. Maybe more. That is not speculation. That is arithmetic. On the 4th night, the barn door latch broke. The wind caught the door and swung it wide open, and suddenly 3 horses were staring into a wall of horizontal snow. Thomas was off the kitchen chair before Clara had set down her coffee. She grabbed the lantern. They ran. He braced the door with his shoulder. All 6 feet 1 inch of him leaned into it, that broad chest flat against the wood, boots sliding in the mud, while Clara held the light steady. The old iron latch had sheared clean through. He pulled a strip of harness leather from the wall, doubled it, threaded it through the latch housing, and secured it with a bent nail driven sideways as a pin. It took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, their shoulders pressed together in the narrow doorway, his charcoal vest against her worn brown leather apron, and neither one of them moved away. The narrator in me wants you to understand something. That was the first time they had touched in 4 months of knowing each other. Inside, after, Clara baked. When the world is trying to kill everything you own, you bake. The last of the stored wine sap apples, sliced a 1/4 inch thin. Cold butter cut into rough gravel. Ice water, 1 tablespoon at a time. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, recording temperatures in the ledger. Morning, 18 degrees. Evening, 14. 2 cups of coffee sat on the stove. Neither person mentioned them. If this story is keeping you company tonight, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, the storm broke on the morning of the 20th. Clara walked the property with the ledger open against her forearm. She recorded it all in that steady, slanted handwriting. All 14 cattle alive. All fence posts holding. Barn intact. Hay dry. Firewood remaining. 31 logs. She had survived, not by luck, by numbers. Thomas stood by the south fence, his brass pocket watch catching the first real sunlight in 6 days, looking across the valley at the damage that had been done to lesser preparations. Henry Pratt rode up to the Hayden fence line on the 7th morning, tested a post with his hand, and nodded once. That nod was the town's verdict. After the storm, the town of Briarton did what small towns do. It rearranged its opinion without admitting it had ever held one. The community gathering came 2 Sundays later. Clara Hayden walked in wearing her dark brown wool skirt and sat where she always sat, the end of the last table, near the door, where nobody had to make room and she didn't have to ask. She set a pie on the table. Wine sap apple, lattice top, raw sugar catching the lantern light like frost on a window pane. Thomas Calloway came in 4 minutes after. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. He did not ask permission. She did not look surprised. He set his hat on his knee and his hands on the table, and that was that. Nobody commented. Not a soul in that room said one word about it. But every eye in the place tracked the movement the way you track a hawk, peripheral, steady, quiet. The general store owner, a man named Greer, who had once suggested to Clara that the Hayden place might benefit from a man's hand, and received a two-word reply he never repeated, nodded at Thomas when he came to the counter the following Wednesday. Thomas bought 20 pounds of flour, a tin of coffee, and a spool of number 9 wire. Greer put it on the Hayden account without being asked. Thomas did not correct him. Clara, standing by the door with the flour-dusted ledger under one arm, recorded the purchase that evening. She wrote both their initials beside the entry. Across the room at that Sunday gathering, Ruth Ames watched from her seat near the stove. Her carved walnut walking stick rested against the table edge, dark and smooth with age. Her sharp brown eyes moved from Thomas to Clara and back again. She said nothing. She did not need to. Ruth Ames had been saying nothing louder than anyone in Briarton for 40 years. Now, before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I ask because this story seems to land different depending on where you've done your living, and I'm curious about that. And if this one's been keeping you company through a long drive or a late shift, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, the reason I tell you about that gathering is because of what happened 3 weeks later. A county livestock inspector rode out to the Hayden Ranch the second week of December. A man named Hardin, mid-50s, leather face, no small talk. He walked the south fence line first. He stopped at every fourth post and pressed his palm flat against the wire, not pulling, not plucking, just pressing, feeling for the right amount of give. The kind of give that means the wire will flex under snow load without snapping and hold tension without pulling the posts. He spent 11 minutes on that fence line alone. He examined the hay stores next, pulled 3 bales from different positions on the raised crib, broke them open, pressed his face close, squeezed handfuls and held them to the light. Checking for moisture, checking for mold, checking for the kind of slow rot that kills cattle in February when you think you've got feed and you don't. Then he came inside. Clara set the ledger on the kitchen table and opened it to October. Hardin read every entry, every date, every number, every temperature recorded morning and evening through the storm. He turned pages slowly. He counted the surviving cattle against the pre-storm total. He compared firewood consumed against firewood projected. He looked at the hay figures, bales fed versus bales remaining, and did the math in his head. He did not praise. He closed the ledger and set it back on the table and said, "Your operation is sound." He signed the inspection form. Clara recorded the date in the ledger. December 14th, 1887. January came cold and stayed cold, the kind of cold where the air itself feels brittle, where sound carries 3 miles, and the silence between sounds carries further. Thomas was splitting wood by the barn at 2 in the morning. The lantern threw a circle of amber light across the frozen ground. Each strike rang out clean and sharp, green pine, still carrying sap, splitting along the grain with that wet crack that sounds nothing like dry oak. He worked steady, not fast, deliberate, the way he did everything. Clara came out in her coat. She stood at the edge of the lantern light, where the amber gave way to blue dark, and she did not speak. Her dark auburn braid hung over one shoulder, loose wisps near her temples catching the light. The small birthmark on her neck was hidden by her collar. Thomas set the axe head down in the stump. He looked at her. The brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain hung against his charcoal vest, and the lantern made it glow like a small fallen star. A long silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that's full of every split log, every corrected fence post, every 2 cups of coffee on the stove, every biscuit wrapped in cloth. Every morning he showed up and every evening he didn't leave. "Stay," she said. One word. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the cold pressed in. Long enough that the lantern flame guttered once and steadied. "Yes," he said. That was the climax. No embrace, no dramatic gesture. 2 people standing in frozen mud by a lantern, having said everything with 2 words. The following Sunday, Thomas carried Clara's pie into the gathering. Clara walked beside him. Ruth Ames watched from her seat, both hands resting on the carved walnut walking stick. Her silver-white hair was pinned tight, not a strand loose. She looked at Clara with those sharp brown eyes and said, "You've been a good woman for 2 years. Maybe it's time to be a happy one." Clara's eyes filled. Ruth turned and walked to her seat. She did not look back. It is 1892. 5 years have passed. Clara and Thomas Calloway are married. The Hayden Ranch is 320 acres of clear title land. The ledger sits on the kitchen table, thick now with 5 years of entries in 2 handwritings, her neat figures and his larger, careful ones beside them. The brass pocket watch sits on the windowsill beside a flower canister. The south fence posts have not been reset in 3 years. They have not needed it. A porch at sunset. Thomas sits in a wooden chair. Clara sits beside him. Their hands touch on the armrest between the chairs. Not clasping, just resting, the way 2 things rest when they've found the place they belong. The evening light falls across the Montana Valley, turning the grass to copper and the mountains to something like memory. Thomas looks at her. Those pale blue eyes, deep set beneath heavy brows, catching the last of the light. He says, "That post wants to be about 4 inches deeper." Clara looks at him. The same gray-green eyes, the same freckles across the bridge of her nose, the same dark auburn braid, secured with rawhide, now touched with early silver at the temples. She does not smile. She does not need to. She'd already decided nobody was coming. She was wrong. 2 cups of coffee on the stove. Nobody needed to explain them anymore. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.